Welcome to the Lightforge podcast. This is ADWCTA. Merps is not here right now. That is just, if you're watching this on YouTube, that's a picture of Merps in some Eastern/Central European country that he's visiting right now, holding what looks like a circle of like potato swirls. It's the best way that I can describe that picture. He sends his regrets of not being able to be here today, and we were really supposed to record this before he left, but then I was like, you know what, we're just gonna hold one back because absolutely sure about this. Blizzard is going to update the arena sometime between when Merps left, which was like 2 weeks ago, and this podcast, and I really want to talk about the rebucketing. As you probably know, there's been no rebucketing. It's been more than a month now since the release of the Boomsday expansion, and plenty of cards are misbucketed. Like, obviously misbucketed. Like, Blizzard stats will tell them that it's misbucketed, so it's not like Blizzard's looking at their stats and being like, oh, everything's great, we don't need to rebucket anything. Blizzard knows they have to rebucket stuff, and it just hasn't happened. So instead of me talking about the buckets before Merps comes back for the next Lightforge, I'm going to talk about a topic that I think we covered briefly like 2 years ago in a Lightforge, but it's something that I want to drill in on, and I'm sure Merps will have a lot to add, but he's not here right now, so you'll just get me, which is fine too, because it's also a topic we can go on forever, and it's getting a read in the arena. Like, it's not like a very basic skill. It's a more advanced skill, but it's incredibly helpful because you can't push an advantage unless you know what advantage you have. And half of knowing what advantage you have is being able to analyze your own deck and your own archetype and what you're doing, which we talk about a lot because that's stuff you have a lot of control over. But the other half of being able to push an advantage is to know what your opponent does not have. And based on what your opponent does not have, that then plays with what you do have and really becomes your advantage. So 3 weeks ago, we did a podcast, and we talked a lot about a general rule that I've had, which is if you're up by 4 tempo or by 2 cards, you basically win the game 85% of the time. Like, assuming that you're pushing the right advantage. Like, if you have like 10 cards up but you have no board, that doesn't really count. I just mean if the game's kind of just like going back and forth, and you're like, who's winning? You're winning if you have 4 on the board, or if you have 2 more cards and you're still just trading with your opponents. So that's a general rule, and it works the same way as getting a read, right? That's not really a read because you know exactly what's happening on the board or in your hand. But what it does do is it sets the relationship between you and your opponent, right? If you have 4 more tempo, you're aggressive and you can push that to a victory. If you have 2 more cards, you just need to survive until your opponent runs out of cards or has to like play a really anti-tempo card to draw cards, and then you're back. For your opponent to gain that 2 extra cards, they have to play the equivalent of a Nourish, which is -5 tempo. And then they would lose like 5 tempo. And remember, 4 tempo means you're winning the tempo game. So they would go 1 over the 4 tempo limit. So that's how that gets worked out. If you have actual reads on your opponent, though, you can make pushes and be confident in doing things, even without like what seems like mathematical advantage on the board or in your hand. I'm reading Twitch chat right now. It says, we need a recording of Merps going yup or yeah every 10 minutes. We thought about doing that. I actually, like, I could create a Merps soundboard and like control a puppet Merps to agree with me. But we didn't think that was necessary. You guys can just fill the void whenever I pause with Merps saying, "Yep, I totally agree with ADWCTA. He's very right about this." So we're gonna break this down into 6 reads, and these are the 6 things that I try to make a read for every single turn I play the game. And I think it's always helpful. It's not even like, oh, it's sometimes helpful. Like, in every single game, by going through this list in my head as I'm making reads, it's helpful. Because at certain points, I'll say something like, well, we know this about the opponent, so this particular path, like let's say trading or like going face or like to making a more risky play, knowing he can't kill us, is the right play. And I'm very confident about that because I have a read. And I'll also preface this with how important your reads are in terms of what are the odds your opponent like top decks the answer, right? You guys know I get really annoyed when my opponent top decks the answer. But like mathematically, it's not really that hard to top deck your answer. If you give your opponent like 2 turns, so like you make a read, one more turn passes, and then the turn after that, you're still relying on a read from 2 turns ago. That's a pretty fresh read. Like you generally rely on that. But if your opponent has 6 cards in their entire deck, that fits the definition of what you're trying to get a read for. So let's say you're getting a read that my opponent cannot deal 2 damage to any of my minions from his hand. It's a pretty basic read. It really limits what your opponent can do, and it means you could do a lot more crazy things on the board, like play snowball cards with no taunt protection, like make the trade while leaving your minion at 2 health and feeling very safe about it. These are things you normally wouldn't be able to do, but you can do it if you have that read. Now, assuming your opponent has even 6 cards in his deck that will deal 2 damage or more, and not be like a hard removal or something from his deck, which he probably does, right? That's a pretty normal number. 6 cards with initiative of around 2 damage, maybe a little more. If that's the case, then after 2 turns, your opponents would have a 40% chance of having either top deck the turn before or just top deck the answer. So having a 60% read is not like the best read. So for things that your opponent may have a lot of, like, for example, single target removals of a certain size. Now, really, your opponent shouldn't have 6 deal 2 damage cards. It's probably more like 4, and then they start getting inefficient with it. So like they maybe deal 4 damage or more, or they're only dealing 1 damage and they need to supplement it with a hero power or something. But if you have these like very common things where it's like, oh, my opponent doesn't have this, but it's super common, then you need like a 1-turn read, or else your opponent can very easily top deck you out of it. But even a 2-turn read is not that bad. You still have a 60% chance of being able to like completely screw your opponent. Like if you put a 6, like a ogre, right, like a 6/7, and you eat like your opponent 6/6, and your opponent doesn't have a ping and is not a ping class. Normally, you may think, oh, I'm gonna, he's probably gonna ping, and then it's not gonna get the advantage. But now you can rely on that. You can have a decent amount of confidence that, like 60% confidence, that your opponent will not be able to remove that off the board the next turn, and so they can't play anything big, because then your 6/1 minion will get value out of your opponent. So that's kind of like the power of having a read, like in a very, very basic way. All right, let's go on to what we're actually having a read for. So we're going to start off with single target removal. This is your basic read. You're always reading for single target removal every single turn. And the only tricky part about this is if your opponent doesn't use a single target removal, it obviously doesn't mean your opponent doesn't have a single target removal in their hand. It means that your opponent just didn't choose to use it. So when do you know that your opponent doesn't have a single target removal in their hand? You know when one of these 3 situations has triggered and a single target removal has not been played. If a single target removal has been played, they can always have a second one. Okay, so the first one is you have a minion on the board and your opponent hangs mana. Your opponent will not hang mana if they have an appropriate amount of removal for the minion that you have put on the board. Unless your opponent is putting something that like matches up perfectly against your minion. Like if your opponent's playing anything in which your minion can get any sort of value and they're hanging mana, then they're not using the removals that they can. So you have a read that they don't have a single target removal of whatever size your minion is. The second one is, I mean, that's pretty basic, because your opponent's not doing stuff. If your opponent doesn't do stuff when your opponent can do stuff, your opponent probably can't do stuff. Second thing, a little more complicated. If your opponent does not remove a creature that gains value for staying on the board. So if you have anything that generates a new thing every turn, like say a Shrieking Shroom, or even something a little less direct than that, like a Cult Master, which doesn't really generate anything, but it's dangerous to let you keep it on the board. certain other cards, just anything that can potentially cause snowball situations, and your opponent knows that they will definitely lose X amount of stuff each turn this is on the board. They will always remove it if they can. If they don't remove it, they're not saving it. They don't have it. And the third one is if your opponent does not remove a creature that will trade very positively. So if your opponent has a 5/5 and you have a 5/2, your opponent will deal 2 damage to remove your 5/2 every single time. So if your opponent does not deal that 2 damage and instead lets you take down your opponent's 5/5, for example, then your opponent doesn't have that 2 damage. That's a pretty solid read. Now, there's a line here somewhere between how effective your trade has to be before your opponent really cares. Like generally, even if I'm trading up by a full +1/+1, like if I'm trading a 3/2 into a 4/3, I don't feel like my opponent would necessarily remove my 3/2. But if I'm trading my 3/2 to my opponent's like 6/3, then yeah, then they couldn't remove the 3/2. So once again, your opponent hangs mana, you have a snowball minion on the board and your opponent does not remove that, or you have a very good trade. Outside of these scenarios, you do not have a read that your opponent does not have a single target removal. Your opponent can drop back a little in tempo to preserve the flexibility of a single target removal. Your opponent can tempo out really hard with single target removal. Single target removals are very good and very flexible. So it's difficult to get this kind of read. Not in that like it's hard for you to get the read, but in that it just won't happen very often, right? If you think about when you're playing, how often do you not have a removal in your hand at all, a single target removal? And of those chances, how often do you think you've fallen into a scenario where you've given your opponent a pretty good read that you don't have it? It's not that frequent. But if you do have this read on your opponent, you can push very hard, right? This is the time when like ridiculous things start happening. You can take any minor trade, like any trade that makes you have 1 minion on the board and your opponent not have a minion. Any kind of eating trade would be great because your minion's guaranteed to survive to the next turn. So that's a read. And remember, these are all reads you make every single turn. The first read, single target removal. Second read, very similar. It's a subset of single target removal and it's buff. So a single target buff requires your opponent to have a creature on the board and requires for the buff to be useful. So that creature on the board, after it gets buffed, has to do something that the creature not buffed wouldn't do. So if you have like a 5/2 on the board and your opponent has a 2/2, you don't really have a read that your opponent doesn't have a buff because he's getting a good trade anyway. If he buffs it, it's going to do the same thing. It would be kind of stupid for him to buff the minion. On the other hand, if you have a 3/3 and your opponent has a 3/3 and your opponent does not play a buff, your opponent doesn't have a buff. If your opponent has a buff, that's a very juicy target, right? You buff your 3/3 into a 5/5, you killed the other 3/3, now you just gained a good amount of tempo on the board. So you take that and you overlay that as an extra condition on top of all the normal single target removal stuff. So if your opponent hangs mana when he could have buffed in a useful way, like at all, like he doesn't have a buff. If he if he does not remove a creature that he needs to kill, and a buff would do it, and you snowball because of that, then he doesn't have a buff. Like all those. This is slightly easier to read than not having a single target removal because it has more stringent requirements. Okay, so those are 2 reads. The third read is a very easy read to make, and you will make this read a lot. It's probably the first or maybe second read that you make in a game, even if you're playing like just at a normal like casual level, and that's my opponent has no single target hard room, so does not remove your large creature, which then gets value by killing his larger creature or by snowballing or by dealing a lot of face damage that your opponent can't afford to take. You play an 8/8, your opponent has 10 health. Your opponent doesn't remove your 8/8 or taunt stuff up. Your opponent can't remove this minion. Your opponent would have if it could. You play an 8/8, your opponent has a 6/7 on the board. Your opponent plays a bunch of smaller minions, lets you take the 6/7. Your opponent can't do a large removal. The thing with single target removals and why it's such a strict like band and why you can't get very good reads on it unless it's very specific is because if I use like 3 mana to deal 3 or 4 damage, which is pretty normal, and remove your thing, I'm not really gaining any tempo out of it, right? I'm not really gaining any card advantage of it. I'm gaining very little on that transaction. So I would only do it when it's super worth it, right? That's why those conditions are, the alternatives of hanging mana, which is doing nothing, the alternatives of having a really bad trade on the board, which is losing a lot of tempo, or the alternatives of preventing my opponent from snowballing. That's a pretty good goal that goes beyond what the normal tempo is worth. Hard removals are different. As soon as you play something like 6/6 or above, it's always worth it for your opponent to hard remove. Like, hard removals are valued according to like an average minion size that they can remove, and that minion size is something like what's Assassinate, right? Assassinate's a very normal hard removal. It's 5 mana. You can get about like a 5/6 or a 6/5 for 5 mana, maybe with a little bonus on top. That's what a hard removal is worth. If you're gonna put out something that has like two more stats on top of it or more, you're gonna get hard removed if you can. Your opponent's not saving that, especially in this meta when there's less big stuff coming out and there's more tokens. You really the hard removals are gonna come out as soon as you put a big thing in them. So very easy observation to make. Now, if you can make the read that your opponent doesn't have a hard removal, it just means you can play your big stuff. And for the most part, it means you should play your big stuff, because your big stuff will be able to cause your opponent a lot of trouble. But it just means you don't have to worry about it. Normally, you'll notice that, especially when we get past turn 5, once we're dealing with 6 mana minions, we're kind of hesitant to play a 6 mana minion on curve. That's not just because a 6 mana minion on curve is less tempo than 2/3 mana minions. It doesn't have as many attacks. It is less flexible. All these good reasons, right? But it's also because it can very easily get the board swung against you. You would only play a 6 mana minion on curve if you're ahead and you're afraid of board clears. So that's what you can do with a single target hard removal. It's the easiest read to make, but it also is not the most helpful read. The buff read is very helpful, because if you know your opponent can't buff, then you can just go face. If your opponent can't buff, then leaving the minions on the board, you literally see all the trades your opponents can do without the buff part. So that's a good way to get a lot of face damage. If your opponent doesn't have single target removal, you can get the board so easily, because your opponent can't make any of your trades inefficient. So any trades you can take, you can take. All right, fourth. So we gone with single target removal, we gone with buff, we gone with single target hard removal. Now we're on to board clears. This is a read you're always making as well, right? Single target hard removal and board clear. Very easy to make this read. You basically have stuff where it would be nice for your opponent to board clear you, and then he doesn't. That's enough. Whenever that happens, you know he doesn't have a board clear. Now, unlike single target hard removal, if you know your opponent doesn't have a board clear, you can really take advantage of it. So I think this is the #1 most common read that people make. And it's very, very useful. And Hearthstone is an attacker chooses game where you decide as the attacker where you want to hit. So having a lot of choices by being on the board is generally very good. And if your opponent doesn't have a board clear, your opponent has no ways to punish you when you're on the board. So you just tempo out as fast as possible. It's also one of the most stable reads to make, because you're only really going to get 3 board clears in any deck, which means your opponent has a very small chance to top deck it. And this read is good for many turns after you first initially make the read. Of course, remember that if you make the read for turn 6 Blizzard, there's also turn 7 Flame Strike, and then there's turn 8 Primordial Drake, which is why Primordial Drake gets me a lot, because at that point, I'm I have all the reads. I know you don't have a board clear unless you have Primordial Drake. So you know what? That's not something I'm going to play around. That's one specific card. You never play around one specific card unless it's the only thing that makes you lose. So the board clear read you should already be doing at all skill levels, and you should know how effective it is if you can get that read. Now, confidence in your reads is very, very important. There's a lot of people that, either we're co-oping or I see them play and they're I don't think he has a board clear, and then makes a wobbly, somewhat tempo, not fully tempo move. And that's never right. If you have a read, you have a read. Notice when we're dealing with all the reads, these are all absolutes. I'm not saying, if your opponent hangs mana when you have a creature on the board, that means your opponent doesn't have a single target removal 95% of the time, and you should therefore play 95% of your tempo. That's not a good like way to approach this. Instead, each one of these is absolute. The truth is, yeah, your opponent could be like just holding and not playing. Your opponent could have misplayed. Like anything could have happened. But when the percent chance of your opponent doing that is small enough, you need to act with the resolution, with the confidence that you have made a 100% correct read. Because if you have made a bad read, not tempoing out is not going to help you that much. On the other hand, not tempoing out will hurt you every single time by the exact percentage that you don't tempo out because you're holding back your read. So if your opponent is not playing optimally because you've made a read and it turns out that it's wrong because your opponent has, let's say, let's take a very basic one, does not remove a creature that gains value for stay on the board. So you have a Shrieking Shroom on the board, your opponent doesn't remove it, you're like, my opponent doesn't have something that deals 2 damage. So next turn, you make a trade, you end up with an 8-2 on the board, and you're like, haha, my opponent can't remove that. And then it turns out your opponent was holding a Holy Smite the whole entire time. That may seem bad. You may think, for the 5% chance that my opponent may be doing that, I don't actually like want to commit too hard to this move. But even if your opponent was holding it, what your opponent has done is basically spotted you some card advantage and tempo by keeping the Shrieking Shroom alive, when your opponent could have just killed the Shroom. So your opponent's already given you a bunch of tempo and card advantage. And by like getting you, and by you playing into this in that 5% of times, you kind of like given your opponent back his tempo and card advantage. Maybe you've given him a little extra. But unless this is happening to you, like, I don't know, a third of the time, a quarter of the time, it's still worth it for you to always go 100%. Like, don't hold back. Just take it from experience, take it from the math. Even though it's correct that 95% of the time is your like confidence interval, you should always act as if you have a 100% read. So when you know your opponent doesn't have a board clear, you throw everything possible onto the board. All right. Two more reads before we get out of this. So we went from very, very important reads that don't happen very often, but you kind of win the game outright if you can make that read, like opponent doesn't have a removal or opponent doesn't have a buff. The two easy to make reads, like opponent doesn't have a hard removal or opponent doesn't have a board clear, and the hard removal part doesn't really win you the game, but the board clear one puts you really far ahead. Taunt is our next read. There's 2 ways to have a read that your opponent doesn't have a taunt. And this is very important because if you know your opponent doesn't have a taunt, you have a lot of options open to you of going face. Now, it's still a risky play to go face, even if you know 100% that your opponent doesn't have a taunt. And that is because your opponent can top deck a taunt. There's plenty of taunts in the game, right? So remember what we were saying about if you have a read that's 2 turns old, that means you only have a read that's accurate 60% of the time. Or else your opponent could have top decked in his last turn or the turn that's coming up the answer. And taunts fall squarely into that category. There are so many taunts in this game right now that if you don't have a read for the taunt for the turn prior to that, you got to be pretty desperate to rely on that read. So this is one of those very tight reads where you got to get the read the turn up. So how do you get a read that your opponent doesn't have a taunt? Besides the obvious one where, oh, I'm like punching my opponent's face, it's getting down to it, my opponent doesn't have a lot of health left, and they don't play a taunt. That probably means they don't have a taunt that they can play at that mana cost yet. The other way to know that, that your opponent doesn't have a taunt is if you have a large creature on the board, and your opponent does not either protect anything or remove your large creature. It just like lets your large creature stay on the board, and they give you the option to pick certain trades. So if I have an 8/8 on the board, and my opponent has like a 6/6 and like a 4/3 and like a 2/1 all on the board, and then they don't remove or taunt, that usually means that they don't have a taunt. They could have a taunt, but that's a pretty solid read that they don't, because that's the time when you want to taunt, right? Especially if you have smaller taunts, because it guarantees you that I won't be able to do anything crazy if you just throw up a taunt. Right? You don't take the face damage in case I can go super aggro. I don't get the great perfect trades that I want. I don't get to buff my minion or heal my minion. It's pretty locked down. So that's your taunt read. More important for like mid-range, especially faster mid-range decks that want to close out the game. Especially if you have something like a Cold Blood, right? Like if you have a read that your opponent doesn't have a taunt, then you Cold Blood and hit face, you're most likely going to win. On the other hand, if you don't have that read and you Cold Blood and you go face, and then your opponent taunts up, it's like, it's still fine, but you haven't gotten like the most value out of it. So it's a good way to, getting a read definitely swings the percentages of what the right choice is. Okay, and finally, reach. Oftentimes, you need to make reads of how much reach your opponent has. Against Mage, it's usually pretty set, right? Like, you're afraid of Pyroblast, you're afraid of Fireball, and everyone knows it, and everyone kind of counts mentally. But I'm talking more general against any class, especially with the neutral card. So, a good way to know your opponent doesn't have reach is if your opponent is just making trades, like pretty standard trades, like 4-4 into 4-4s, 2-2s into 2-2s, 1-1s into 1-1s. If they're still making trades when you have like 15 health, then they don't have a lot of reach. If they have even 4 damage of reach, at that point you're going to start hitting face a lot more. And again, your opponent could be misplaying and making these trades, but if your opponent's misplaying and making these trades, they're already handing you the advantage. So you always pretend your opponent is not misplaying. The other way to know your opponent doesn't have any reach is when you know your opponent doesn't have any initiative. So all the reads we were making before, single target removal, buffs, single target hard removals, board clears. If you have all those reads and you're like, well, my opponent just has no initiative right now, they can't like do anything, then your opponent doesn't have reach either. Sure, they could have a Pyroblast. Sure, they could have like a Life Drinker or something weird that just only goes phase and can't actually interact with the board. But that's such a small percent of times that, you know, the Pyroblast, you got to play around 10 damage if you have a good read on the Pyroblast aside. You have a pretty good read that your opponent doesn't have, like, let's say, like an Argent Commander or something else that's going to put you under. And if you're desperate enough, sometimes you make those plays, right? Sometimes you're just like, look, if my opponent has 2 damage, I lose. And that's fine. And you see me and Merps make those plays all the time. And, like, chat always gets a little antsy. It's like, oh, but you lose with, like, X damage. And it's like, yeah, but you play to win, right? You don't play to survive another turn. Your opponent develops the board some more, gets a couple more damage in, and then you're getting lower and lower, and you have less and less options. Right? Like, that's fine if you have bailout cards in your deck that you're trying to draw. But otherwise, if you think you can grab the board back or punish your opponent by doing a move that just requires you don't die for 1 turn, it's usually worth it. And having reads helps a lot with that. So that's the list of reads. Notice that I haven't listed any specific cards. Like, this is not a podcast episode about, oh, does my opponent have a Pyroblast or not? How does my opponent play if they have, I don't know, Ultimate Infestation? Those are not what I'm dealing with specifically here. These are things that are meta-less. Doesn't matter which meta you're playing in. Doesn't matter what cards are in the pool. This doesn't even really matter what card game you're playing. As long as you're playing an attacker chooses card game, these rules are going to apply. So you can like take it and port it over to any other card games you play, and these are still the ways you get the same reads. Just general like card game rules. Don't port it over to Magic the Gathering. These are attacker chooses. It's a big difference once it's defender chooses. So yeah. So if you have actually, and I'm going to stress again, I know I've said this like 3 times already, but I want to stress again that all of these things are 100% reads. Like, it's like a binary thing. Like, did my opponent do this? Oh, my opponent did not do this? Well, then I have a read. It's not like, oh, it's a little fuzzy, like maybe he has this, maybe he doesn't. The only thing that you will get screwed with following this is like top decks, and like depending on which turn you made the read, you know, you may be giving your opponent a number of top decks. So yeah. These are the reads that go through your entire game. I'm reading chat right now. Taro says, 1 key read, does opponent have small mana minions? Yes. That's a read for the early turns. If your opponent misses a drop, your opponent doesn't have small minions. That's a pretty basic read. Yeah, and you know you can play based on that to deal with opponent's hero powers and to block them out, and you should. But that's like first couple turns stuff. Like that stops being a thing pretty quickly. It's really more part of like the curve stone and like how to make sure you curve out better than your opponent, even though you don't really have better cards than your opponent. Part of it, not like as the game goes, like how the game like develops, right? That's more like getting the advantage right now and making sure your opponent, like to exploit your opponent's like bad draws. But that's definitely also a relevant read for the first few turns. All right. Yeah. So if you have these reads and you are getting these reads, because remember, these are reads a computer can do. I can literally program a bot to make these reads for you. And these reads are 100%. Not that they're effective 100% of the times, but you should always play as if they are effective 100% of the time. So the normative value that these provide is that they tell you exactly what the right play is. And that's a very important distinction from these are always 100% true. Regardless of whether they're 100% true or not, it is always correct to play as if they are 100% true. And if you do that, and you have normal like mechanics that make you like a 3-win player, it should just carry you to like 5-6 wins just on reads alone. Because if you know how to play the game, you know how to play half of the game. You know how to play your half of the game. Once you have reads and you know what to do once you have the reads, then you're playing the other half of the game as well. Like always play your opponent's turn if possible. And getting reads is the basic way you play your opponent's turn. So now there's no interacting on the opponent's turn, right? There's no instance like an MTG, but that's how you play your opponent's turn. And that's also why we're generally intently watching our opponents and being like, that's fine, that's fine. So you just keep making your reads as it goes. If you have to try to make your reads on your turn, it takes up rope, right? And if you're thinking about a bunch of other stuff, then you don't want to use any time on your turn thinking about the stuff. So whenever your opponent hits end turn, you should already have the reads in your hand. Because what else are you doing on your opponent's turn, right? Yeah, so that's like I think it's a pretty major part of getting to that like high win rate. And it's also a part that I think some people pick up on more than other people. You also hear me say a lot when I'm playing, like, why am I doing this move? It's like anti-tempo, or it's just like not good, or I'm like trading off a minion when I can eat the minion with a different minion, and just doing things that you're just like, regular players wouldn't do that. Why would you do that? And usually I'm not like playing around a specific card. Merps plays around specific cards more. I think some other players play around specific cards more. I just don't like to think about specific cards as much. It's like it's a lot of thinking because there's like a lot of cards in the game. And if you can just gather more general principles, right? Especially because it's the arena, you can, you know, it's not like I know their deck list. If you can gather these general principles and apply them, you can get like pretty far without any of the very specific minute stuff. And if you focus on the specific minute stuff, given the finite amount of resources that is your brain power and the rope, you're going to miss some of these bigger picture stuff that is more important. So if you can do this and you have a basic grasp of things, you should be like above a 6-win pretty easily. And you'll see me oftentimes do things that look really weird and bad. And when the question is asked, I would just say something like, oh, I have a read that the opponent has this. And you're like, okay, like fine. If the opponent has this, you've gained like 1 tempo, or like you've prevented the loss of 1 tempo if your opponent like doesn't have a buff. But if your opponent does, then you've lost like 8 tempo, right? Like, is this really worth it? And the answer is, well, on a 1 to 8 scale, probably not, because the opponent could top deck something. But on a 1 to 4 ratio, if I have the read from the turn prior, yeah, it's worth it. I'll take a guaranteed -3 stats to avoid -4 stats you know, given my reads. So, like I said, act as if your reads are 100%. Those are things that it's very difficult. Those are decisions that it's very difficult for players to make because it involves absolute trust in your reads. And you don't have to be like brilliant to make good reads. The checklist that I kind of laid out is pretty basic. It's binary, and a computer can do it just by looking at what your opponents are playing, and there's no math involved, right? So you can do it too. And it doesn't take any extra time because you're doing all this thinking on your opponent's turn. That's all that it is about reads. Let's move on to question from the goat. I actually reached out to Merps. Merps is chatting live right now from wherever the hell he is in Europe, and he says nope, he does not have a question of the goat for you guys, but he does want to report that he is fat now. That's his report. And if you want like a food tour of Central Europe, go check out his Twitter. It's pretty regular updates with photos. So that is question from the goat, I guess, brought to you by our patrons, patreon.com/grinninggoat. We'll have a better one for you next week when Merps is back. In the meantime, our patrons, thank you guys so much. You really help us stay afloat here. And if you want to help feed the goat, head over to patreon.com/grinninggoat. That's our main source of donations. That's not like a subscription, the way like Twitch Prime or like Twitch is. Yeah. And we're gonna keep this short. That's it for this Lightforge. Wow. Looks like we can go below 45 minutes. It just involves having 50% less people on this podcast. But Merps will be back next week, and we'll talk more strategy. This is what I love about this meta. When we're in the Boomsday meta, never have I ever entered a meta and been able to start talking about core mechanics rather than like, oh, do we have to play around this specific card? Or, oh, you know, how has the meta totally changed? Never have I ever been able to do that as quickly. Because you eventually get there, right? No matter how weird they make the meta, like eventually towards like the end of an expansion cycle, you're like, well, I guess they're not tweaking it anymore. Let's just talk about how to play the game. But here we've done, this is I think the 4th episode in a row, maybe the 3rd episode in a row already. That's less about Boomsday and more about how to play limited Hearthstone, no matter what they throw at you. And I think that's a reflection of a very fundamental skill-based meta, which is where we're in right now. So enjoy it, and we'll see you guys in the arena. Until next time, this is ADWCTA. This is Merps. See you guys.